Rural folk, what is the most creepy thing you've seen or experienced? I lived way out in the deep country when I was 15 years old. We were so isolated that it would take us a full hour just to drive to the closest grocery store. If we had an emergency, it would take the state police at least 45 minutes to reach our front door. There were no neighbors close by. The silence of those open fields was completely deafening. Out there, you quickly realize a terrifying truth. If something happens to you, absolutely no one will hear you scream. One particular night, a heavy, suffocating gut feeling hit my stomach. Every instinct told me that something out in the dark was completely wrong. I tried to ignore it and force myself to sleep, convincing my brain it was just a random spike of anxiety. Then, at exactly 2 a.m, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence. I woke up instantly, my body completely frozen in terror. These screams did not sound human. They were demonic, rapidly switching from the high-pitched screech of a woman to the deep, guttural growl of a man. The entire household woke up in a panic. My stepdad did not hesitate. He immediately grabbed his loaded shotgun. We stood near the door, straining our ears. Mind you, this is the deep countryside. There are no streetlights out here. The world outside was a pitch-black void, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of our single porch light. The screaming and screeching continued to echo from the tree line. It sounded like two people tearing each other apart. Panic turned into absolute dread when my mom realized my older sister had gone out with her boyfriend earlier that day, and she still had not returned. Based on the sheer agony of those screams, my mom truly believed my sister was being murdered in the woods right behind our house. Driven by pure maternal instinct, my mom started screaming out into the dark. "Jason! Jason, you let go of her! Get your hands off her! Where are you?" Suddenly, the screaming stopped. The woods went absolutely silent. We stood there trembling, thinking my sister was already dead, and that whoever did it was now stalking toward us in the shadows. Then a completely different noise broke the silence. It was the booming voice of a man, but warped, sounding completely unhinged. He began to bellow into the night. "I am Jacob. I am the Son of God." His voice echoed off the trees as he continued to yell. "I am chosen to find the baby. Only I can make this passage. Only I can find this baby in Valen." Now we were completely paralyzed with fear. We thought my sister's boyfriend was part of some fanatic cult, and that he was coming to eliminate our entire family next. My mom finally dialed the police, her hands shaking, while this individual kept screeching, howling, and creeping closer and closer to our walls. After about 30 agonizing minutes of this psychological torture, we finally spotted a shape moving into our field of vision. A silhouette emerged right next to our parked car. My stepdad raised his weapon and fired a warning shot into the dirt nearby. He bellowed at the top of his lungs, "Don't you get any closer now!" The shadow did not stop. It kept creeping forward on the ground. My stepdad racked the slide and fired another shot, much closer to the intruder's position. "Now don't make me kill you," he warned. With that second loud blast, we finally heard the individual turn around and scramble back up into the thick brush. We locked the doors and waited for the authorities to arrive. Finally, after 45 long minutes, a police cruiser tore through our driveway. The deputy aggressively swerved his car and shined his high-intensity spotlight directly onto the perpetrator. We looked through the window, and we could not believe the absolute horror of what we were seeing. Standing in the beam of light was a painfully skinny, completely naked man with a shaved head. He was not walking upright. He was crawling on all fours like a wild gorilla, moving with a bizarre, jerky agility. The deputies rushed him, wrestling him to the ground while he kept screeching and howling like an animal the entire time. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser and just drove off. They did not even walk up to our porch to explain what was happening. We were just left there, forced to go back to sleep in the dark like nothing had occurred. The next day we called the local station to find out who had invaded our property. It turned out to be one of our distant neighbors, a young man who was a known repeat substance offender. He had mixed a massive toxic cocktail of different street drugs and had suffered an extreme psychotic break from reality. It was a terrifying night that exposed the dark underbelly of rural isolation. For those who do not live out in the country, this is the true horror we often have to face. When help is miles away, you are completely on your own. When I was a kid, the countryside felt infinite, but it also felt completely empty. Two of my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned house that sat further down our gravel road. It had that typical, decayed rural look. The paint was peeling off heavily, exposing rotted wood underneath, and wild vines were choking the porch. The windows were shattered, and several clay roof tiles were missing here and there. It looked like the kind of place where time had just stopped. We walked inside through a busted door, and the interior matched the decay perfectly. The kitchen cupboards were broken off their hinges, and the floorboards splintered and cracked under our sneakers. The air was heavy with the smell of old dust and damp earth. Other than the house being completely hollowed out, we did not really get any scary vibes from it at first. Nothing stood out to us as paranormal or like the ghost stories we always talked about. We expected something obvious, but the place just felt dead. So we decided to leave the property, feeling mildly disappointed by the lack of adventure. We were walking back along the outside of the structure, right next to one of the broken side windows, when we all froze. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Out of nowhere, this very well-dressed, perfectly groomed man appeared right inside the room we had just left. He looked to be in his 60s, wearing a pristine black dress coat, a sharp white shirt, and a solid black tie. We had not seen him anywhere inside. We never heard a single footstep on those loud, cracked floorboards. Yet there he was, standing in the shadows of that ruined house, just staring at us blankly through the window. His eyes were completely empty, showing no anger, no movement, just a cold, dead stare. My friends and I did not say a word. We just booked it as fast as we had ever run in our lives, sprinting all the way back down the road to our house, our hearts hammering against our ribs. Looking back, my rational mind tells me it was probably just one of the property owners who happened to visit that exact same day. But good God, that sudden silent presence in the middle of nowhere scared the shit out of us. A few years later, the local fire department burnt the place down in a controlled exercise. So if it actually was something paranormal, well, it is gone now. Cultural note. In many rural areas across the United States, local volunteer fire departments utilize donated abandoned properties for what is known as a controlled burn or live fire training. This practice allows firefighters to practice real-world suppression tactics, ventilation, and structural analysis in a controlled environment before the building is completely leveled for safety reasons. I was walking back home from a friend's house one evening. My usual route took me straight downhill, navigating a narrow dirt path through a deeply isolated forest. It was getting quite late, so the entire woods had turned into a massive wall of shadows. There was just a faint sliver of moonlight shining through the thick canopy above. It provided just enough visibility that it was technically possible to stay on the path without turning on a flashlight. The silence out there in the country was heavy, broken only by the wind. Just as I reached the absolute middle of the forest path, the atmosphere shifted. I suddenly started hearing heavy twigs snapping and dried leaves cracking under distinct footsteps on my immediate right. I froze solid in the dirt, my eyes straining to pierce through the thick brush. I looked everywhere, trying to see if someone was stalking me. Nobody was there. Then, an unsettling grumbling noise became audible. It sounded exactly like a massive heavy creature grumbling to itself just a few feet into the darkness. The sound was incredibly loud, and it was right next to me. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I managed to squeeze out a frightened, trembling, "Hello?" into the void, but the eerie grumbling and the sharp snapping of branches just continued. I was scared shitless. I had lived near the countryside for a long time, but I had never heard a sound that hostile before. To make things worse, local authorities had recently issued official warnings about aggressive brown bears roaming those nearby woods. My entire body was trembling from the pure adrenaline rush. I somehow managed to pull my phone out of my pocket, unlocked it with slippery fingers, and turned on the built-in flashlight. I aggressively shined the beam straight out in front of me. What I saw was absolutely nothing. The trees were vacant, but that deep grumbling noise just continued right beside my boots. Terrified, I slowly angled the flashlight beam down toward the damp ground. That is exactly when I finally saw it. A goddamn hedgehog. The little guy was only about a meter away from me, aggressively burrowing through the dirt for worms or God knows what else. But the sheer volume of the sounds he was producing made it seem like a predator 100 times bigger was ready to pounce on me. In that moment of intense relief and anger, I honestly wanted to punt that little fucker down into the valley. So yeah, that is the one memorable time I almost completely shat my pants due to pure, unadulterated fear out in the forest. I am from a small town in Appalachia, and my grandpa lived out in the relative boonies. I was back home from college once in the middle of autumn, and I went down the winding roads to visit him at his isolated property. We ended up talking for a while, losing track of time. It was completely pitch black by the time I was finally going to take off and head back to my mom's house. He walked me to the back door, which opened up to a small wooden porch. A set of creaky stairs led straight down to a concrete stoop. There was a single bulb outside light fixture hanging above, throwing just enough dim amber light to see the immediate ground. My driveway was probably 15 yards away from the house. Since I had parked behind his vehicle, it was maybe a total of 20 yards to my Jeep, and only about 15 more yards beyond that to the edge of the dense black woods. The forest out there felt completely massive and suffocating at night. As soon as I hit the bottom step and took about 2 cautious steps forward into the dark, something stopped me completely cold. It was almost a physical sensation, like hitting an invisible wall. The hair on my arms stood straight up, my breathing went incredibly shallow, and my heart rate spiked into overdrive. My feet were just screaming inside my head. Fuck no, we are not going forward. Being a born and raised hillbilly, I knew better than to ignore that primal gut feeling. The first thing I did was draw my concealed handgun, snapping it out and pointing it directly toward the driveway and the dark woods beyond, while I slowly slid my body back toward the porch. I took a quick look behind me, and Grandpa had already stepped out onto the deck. He had his by the door shotgun raised and pointed in the exact same general direction. He felt it too. I carefully backed up the wooden steps, and he kept his weapon leveled to cover me until I reached the threshold. We quickly stepped inside, slammed the heavy door, and bolted it shut. I immediately called my ma and told her I was just going to stay the night since it was already so late. We sat up for hours in the living room, trying to figure out what had tripped both of our oh shit meters at the exact same millisecond. but we could never come up with a satisfactory answer. Neither of us consciously saw or heard a single thing out of the ordinary in the yard. And neither of us are the type of people to get easily freaked out by campfire stories. My grandpa was a World War II Marine who fought all over the Pacific Theater, and I had been hunting and camping deep in those mountains with him since I could barely walk. As we watched the dark windows, he looked at me and said the only other time he had ever experienced that exact physical feeling of dread was during the war on Iwo Jima. It was the same biological alert he felt right before a late-night bonsai charge, or just before a hidden sniper up in a palm tree took a shot at his unit. Something was watching us from the trees. Cultural note: during World War II, the Battle of Iwo Jima in the Pacific Theater became one of the most brutal and intense campaigns in military history. American Marines constantly had to face what were known as late-night bonsai charges, massive frontal suicide assaults where waves of Japanese soldiers would suddenly emerge from the pitch-black darkness with fixed bayonets and combat screams. Veterans who survived these battlefields developed a state of tactical hypervigilance. This is an extreme biological response where the brain processes subtle environmental microsignals, such as the sudden silence of local wildlife or faint shifts in the wind, alerting the body to an invisible, deadly threat before the conscious mind can even register it. I had just turned 16 years old, and I was driving back home entirely alone in the pitch black of night. I was navigating a narrow, isolated back road in the absolute middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of dense, towering trees on both sides of the asphalt. At one specific stretch of the road, the thick tree line on my left briefly cleared, opening up a small window into the night sky. The very moment I reached that clearing, my eyes caught something that completely froze my breath. I saw 5 massive, almost perfect circles of fiery, yellowish-orange light hanging high in the dark sky. They were not moving. They were just hovering silently over the wilderness, defying every law of physics. 2 of these glowing structures were positioned close to each other more to the left, while the other 3 were aligned in a tight pattern more to the right. But all 5 of them were relatively close in the formation. There was absolutely no movement from them, no mechanical sound, and no engine hum, just dead silence. Again, these were large, intensely glowing circles. They looked absolutely nothing like the tiny dots of light you would typically see from a commercial aircraft or a drone. After about 15 seconds of driving in complete shock, the tree line got heavily dense again. The dark canopy immediately blocked the sky from my view, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I was about 30 seconds away from the very end of that gravel road. As I finally reached the main intersection and the trees cleared out for good, I got another 10 seconds of viewing those mysterious lights. Suddenly, the 5 spheres grew slightly brighter, pulsating with intense energy for a split second, and then they vanished pretty much instantly and simultaneously into the void. To this day, I still have absolutely no idea what I witnessed out there. Again, this bizarre encounter happened in the middle of nowhere, hours away from any major city. There are no known military facilities or government entities anywhere near that sector. I have rattled my brain for years on every logical theory possible: fireworks, missile tests, falling meteors, or classified military aircraft. Absolutely none of them make any sense. The whole experience was so incredibly eerie. The fact that those fiery shapes remain completely unexplained weirds me out to this very day. Cultural note: in the United States, rural areas away from major light pollution are frequent hotspots for unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP sightings. While many accounts are later attributed to military flares or atmospheric anomalies, the high desert and isolated timberlands of the country continued to generate unexplained reports due to the vast, unmonitored airspace. Depending on the beholder, this is either a ballsy or completely stupid story I can throw into the mix of all these close animal encounters out in the wild. For about 8.5 months, I lived straight out of a camper shell I built on the back of my small Japanese pickup truck. I spent that time driving from the East Coast to the West Coast, couch surfing during some breaks, and parking in lots of isolated places in between. During this run, I got some work doing renovations on a house down in Sonora, California. The owner and his family were the coolest people, and they actually offered to let me park my rig anywhere I liked on their 8 acres of rural property until we finished up the house to put it on the market. Having a stable, safe campsite changed things up for me. The weather was absolutely perfect for that time of year, so I decided to sleep in a hammock strapped right beside my truck. On the very first morning, the owner's wife spotted me out there. She made it a point to warn me that they had lost 2 of their goats to a mountain lion just the year prior. Then, one evening at dusk, she and her son actually caught that exact same mountain lion walking right up their gravel driveway on video. The predator was back. I knew the inherent risk of sleeping outside, but I figured those big cats are far too terrified of human scents, artificial lights, and loud sounds to ever realistically mean problems for me. That is the case for 99% of them anyway. You just have to be noisy before bed and you are set. After lights out at night, I would usually sit and browse the web for a while inside the cab of my truck, utilizing an inverter to charge up my electronics. One night, I was not quite done going in and out of the camper shell and the truck bed, so I had left both the tailgate and the rear hatch wide open. It was well into the night, and I was just sitting there in the dark cab, reading away on my phone. All of a sudden, my entire truck heavily lurched from a sharp dip in the rear end. Something massive was in the back of my truck. I have shuttled people around in that truck bed before, and I have a very precise sense of how the rear leaf springs react under weight, because I have owned this vehicle for so many years. This sudden dip felt exactly as if a slightly less than or equal to 200-pound man had just plopped his body right onto my open tailgate. Oh shit. My immediate panic thought was that a person was invading my space, but as I sat there frozen, I realized there was no way it was a human. I was parked on loose, crushed gravel that completely gives away the approach of anything putting body weight on it. Unless this person was floating, I would have heard the crunching steps. That theory was thrown straight to the wind with a sudden heavy jump onto the metal tailgate. It was not a dude. A useless wide-eyed check of my rear-view mirrors showed nothing but absolute darkness, so I started thinking of a better survival plan. I was absolutely not getting out of that protective cab. I reached over and manually locked both doors. My keys were already turned to the accessory position to run my chargers, so with less than an eighth of a turn of the ignition, the truck roared to life. I revved the engine hard, the loud exhaust matching the frantic rate of my heart, but I did not blast the horn because I did not want to wake up the family and their 5 young kids up in the main house. The engine plan worked. Suddenly, the truck springs snapped right back up, completely unweighted. The loud mechanical noise had scared the cat off. A mountain lion in the pitch black of night had actually pounced straight into the back of my truck. I shut the engine off and waited things out for a good agonizing while. Finally, everything seemed clear. The ballsy or stupid part of my personality comes right now. I was 21 years old, and this cross-country trip was the ultimate adventure I had dreamed about since I was a little kid. I do not engage in wild behaviors, but I honestly feel all but dead inside until I face some kind of real adversity or physical challenge. That is when I truly come alive. Anyway, I refused to back down or sleep inside the cab. I had a slight dehydration on my side from working all day, and I knew my urine was going to smell exceptionally strong because of it. I stepped out and marked my territory, marking all over the trees my hammock was strapped to, and creating a thick chemical barrier underneath and in a circle around the hammock itself. I did that every single night for the next 2 weeks with absolutely no problems until we finished the construction job. It felt ballsy back then, but looking back now, it was just plain stupid. Cultural note: Sonora, California is located in the Sierra Nevada foothills, a rugged and heavily wooded rural region known for having a dense population of cougars, commonly referred to as mountain lions. These apex predators are strictly territorial and possess a highly developed sense of smell. However, wildlife biologists state that human urine does not act as a reliable deterrent against them, making close proximity sleeping after an encounter an extreme physical risk. When I was a kid, my family and I took a trip up to northern Wisconsin. The wilderness up there feels infinite, dense, and heavily isolated. One afternoon, my dad, my brother, and I went out for a hike, just navigating our way through some thick, unfamiliar woods. We eventually emerged from the tree line and realized we had accidentally walked straight onto someone else's private land. The owner of the property spotted us almost immediately. He walked up to us, accompanied by his young son, and asked the obvious question, "What you doing on my property?" My dad did not hesitate to apologize. He told the man we were just out hiking and that he should have been way more careful with our route. We turned around and headed back quickly. While the encounter was definitely odd, the air did not feel tense or dangerous at the time. My brother and I actually learned a solid lesson that day about respecting land boundaries in the deep countryside. However, the guy we encountered was apparently not satisfied with a simple apology. He actually got some local goon, someone who either worked for him or was related to him, to track our movements. This man literally followed our footprints through the dense brush, tracking us all the way back to our rental cabin. About 5 minutes after we got back inside and started to prepare some lunch, the cabin door swung open. This complete stranger literally waltzed right inside our private space. He immediately started talking about how we were caught trespassing down the road. He was not yelling, and he did not even sound angry, but it was still incredibly jarring. Having some random guy dressed in full military camo just barge uninvited into your grandparents' house will completely freeze the blood in your veins. He did not have a lot of time to say much, though. My grandparents owned a few firearms for protection out in the woods, and sure enough, one got pulled on him in a matter of seconds. My grandma held this guy up at gunpoint, keeping her weapon locked directly onto him. She actually apologized again for our prior mistake of trespassing on his boss's land. Then, she started to yell at him with pure fury for tracking us down, trespassing on our rented property, and straight up barging inside our home uninvited. Faced with a loaded barrel, the guy finally backed off and left. It was a deeply unnerving encounter that still leaves a heavy feeling in my stomach. I have talked to my dad and brother about it on occasion over the years, just to confirm it was not a nightmare or a trick of my imagination. Either way, do not trespass out in the country. That is the ultimate lesson I learned. Cultural note: in rural areas of the United States, particularly in heavily forested states like Wisconsin, land boundaries are fiercely protected, and the cultural concept of castle doctrine often applies. This legal framework allows individuals to use force, including firearms, to protect themselves against intruders who unlawfully and forcefully enter their occupied home or vehicle without invitation. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. My uncle used to live way out in the country on a piece of land that sat completely isolated. He managed a plot that was just a little less than 8 acres. His closest neighbors were not terribly far away if you had a car, within a quick driving distance, but they were also just far enough that walking there in the pitch black was not a viable option at all. Anyway, I spent the summer after my 8th grade year staying out there with him. The silence of the countryside at night was already heavy enough, but he had one specific story that absolutely scared the shit out of me back then. He kept an array of livestock and animals on the farm. Every single night, like clockwork, he would make his usual rounds through the property. He just wanted to make sure every animal was exactly where they were supposed to be, and that all the pens and gates were securely locked up for the night. One evening, as he was walking back toward the rear of his house, his dog suddenly started going completely wild. At first, he did not give much care to it. Dogs bark at passing shadows all the time in the country, so he just continued on his way. But these dogs were relentlessly barking, their teeth bared, sounding genuinely threatened. He stopped and pointed his heavy flashlight around the perimeter, cutting through the dense fog, but he did not see anything. He finally reached the back door of his house, with the dog still barking frantically at the tree line. He felt a strange chill on his neck, forcing him to turn around one last time. Way out in the middle of his dark fields, he spotted what looked like a moving shadow. He automatically assumed it was just a rogue coyote or some other common wild animal, so he just ignored the bad feeling in his gut and went inside. The very next night, as he stepped outside to make his usual rounds, he was immediately forced to stop. His boots froze in the dirt. He spotted some sort of shadowy figure standing just a short distance away from his main barn. He did not say a word, but his hand instantly went to his holster, and he took out his gun. Again, his initial thought was that maybe a coyote was trying to break into the coop to get his chickens. However, as he took a few cautious steps forward, the air went completely dead. The figure suddenly stood up straight, completely human-like, and bolted into the open field, covered entirely by the thick darkness. My uncle said he was so startled by the speed and the unnatural posture of the shape that he just froze solid for a moment. By the time he recovered his senses, he yelled out a loud, aggressive, "Hey!" He did not give chase to whatever or whoever it was. It was way too dark, and the isolation of the farm meant no one was coming to help him if things went south. He did tell me that for about a week after that incident, his dogs would still go absolutely ballistic at night, but he never saw that shape again. When he was telling me the story, he tried to rationalize it by saying it probably could have just been a transient passing through. But I don't know. The dude lived in the literal middle of nowhere, and he had to drive like 40 minutes just to get to a grocery store. It seems incredibly bizarre for some random homeless person to even be out in that specific area. He also mentioned it could have been a black bear, but I don't know about that either. He was not even close to the kind of terrain that black bears typically inhabit. The man lived in a flat, rural country farming area, not anywhere remotely close to mountains, thick forests, or heavy timber. Something was out there in his fields, watching him from the dark. I used to live in a tiny, isolated country town with a total population of only 212 people. It was a deeply rural environment where the woods surrounded every single home, and folks routinely hunted for game right in their own backyards. The silence out there at night was heavy, but during my time in that place, 3 specific incidents occurred that completely shattered my sense of security. The first happened around midnight. I was inside when I heard my ex-husband's dog suddenly losing his absolute shit outside. This dog was usually completely calm, and he never ever acted like that. Since it was the middle of the night, the erratic barking sounded even scarier. My ex-husband worked the 3rd shift, the graveyard shift, so it was entirely on me to figure out what was going on. I did not want anything bad to happen to our animal. I grabbed a flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped out into the crisp night air. I swept the beam across the yard, and right at that moment, a massive bear came straight around the corner of our storage shed. This creature was only about 200 feet away from me. Maybe that does not seem close to you, but I was a 21-year-old woman alone in the dark with a tiny plastic flashlight, living in an old trailer made of basically aluminum foil. Yeah, I freaked right the hell out, ran back inside, and locked the door with my hands shaking. The second incident happened during my second Christmas living in that same trailer. I was relaxing one night when the phone rang. It was an automated emergency call from the local prison, notifying residents that there had been a dangerous escape. The voice on the line stated, they believed the prisoner was heading directly into our immediate area. They told us to stay alert, shut the blinds, do not answer the door, do not step outside, and call the cops about anything suspicious. At first, I honestly thought it was a sick holiday prank call, but I called up a few of my neighbors, and they had all received the exact same automated alert. I looked it up on the news, and yup, it was completely real. I did not sleep a single wink that night. The final incident was by far the worst. One evening, my ex-husband's car refused to start, so I had to drive him to work. He worked at a 24/7 grocery store, so I decided to do some shopping while I was already there. When I finally got back home, I carried the first load of grocery bags to the front door. As I stepped inside, I had to physically block a stray neighborhood dog from sneaking into the living room with me. I managed to push him back, closed the door tightly, locked it, and started putting the groceries away in the kitchen. Suddenly, a strange scratching noise echoed from the living room. I walked over to check it out, and I froze solid. Standing right there in the middle of the room was the exact same dog I had just blocked from entering. My mind short-circuited. For a split second, I genuinely thought our crappy trailer just had a massive hole in the wall that I did not know about. I stood there staring at the dog for a few seconds, trying to process what to do, when the heavy back door suddenly slammed shut with a violent bang. Truly freaked out now, pure adrenaline took over. I grabbed a sharp kitchen knife from the counter and crept toward the back of the trailer to check it out. The back door was wide open, with the cold night wind slamming it repeatedly against the outside wall. I quickly pulled it shut, locked it, and called my ex-husband in a panic. He just brushed it off, telling me I was completely fine, and that it was probably just a loose lock that caught the wind. But when we inspected the back door the very next morning, the reality of the situation turned my stomach. Someone had violently twisted the mechanism, nearly breaking the heavy metal doorknob clean off from the outside. Yup, someone had actively tried to break into my home, and they were likely already hiding inside the trailer when I first arrived. It scared the living daylights out of me. My little brother and I were out in the yard, casually tossing a baseball back and forth near dusk. We were hanging out at the very bottom of our family property, which consisted of 30 heavily wooded mountain acres located way in the middle of absolute nowhere. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and it had gotten dark enough that the ball was becoming hard to track. We were just about to call it quits and head inside for dinner when the heavy silence of the mountain completely shattered. Out of nowhere, we heard the single most horrifying scream we have ever encountered either before or since that evening. The sound ripped through the thick trees just beyond the very edge of our small clearing, freezing both of us completely solid in our tracks. Imagine a human woman screaming in absolute mortal agony, writhing in the most wretched, brutal torment imaginable. Think of every single tortured shriek you have ever heard in horror movies, war films, or historical documentaries. Absolutely nothing compared to the raw terror of this sound. Even now, decades removed from actually hearing it with my own ears, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stands straight up just thinking about that exact moment. The memory is made even worse by the unsettling realization of what that horrific entity actually was. It was a mountain lion. It turns out that full-grown female mountain lions emit a loud, piercing scream when they are in heat. To the human ear, it sounds exactly like a woman being torn to pieces by the devil himself. To hear that raw, blood-curdling sound as two young kids completely alone in the pitch black in the middle of nowhere was about as terrifying as life can possibly get. We did not even bother to look for the baseball. We just bolted toward the house, completely consumed by the dark. I used to live out in the high desert for about a year. When you are that isolated, the night plays cruel tricks on your mind. On those nights when the moon is completely hidden, or thick clouds block out the stars, the world turns into a pitch-black void. You literally cannot see more than 10 yards ahead of your own face. One night, I was driving down the empty highway, heading back home after a long shift. The road was completely vacant, surrounded by miles of nothing but sand and brush. Suddenly, my headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated a man running on the shoulder of the highway. He was not jogging, the guy was full-on sprinting for his life. I was cruising at 70 miles per hour, so the entire encounter only lasted for a second or two, but it immediately triggered a massive red flag in my head. What the hell was he running from out here? I genuinely hoped he was okay, but there was absolutely no way I was pulling over in the middle of nowhere. I kept my foot on the gas, trying to shake off the weird adrenaline spike, but then, maybe a full minute later, my headlights caught something else on the shoulder. It was another man walking casually along the side of the highway. I froze behind the wheel, and the hair on my arm stood straight up. I swear to God, it looked like the exact same man. He had the same build, the same clothes, the same features. How could there be two separate, identical guys walking and running on the side of a pitch-black highway in the middle of the desert? What possible reason could explain that? I kept my eyes peeled, but I did not see any broken-down cars on the side of the road. There were no flashing hazards, no empty vehicles, nothing. The complete lack of logic behind it left me utterly terrified. I was so incredibly weirded out that a heavy, suffocating dread settled over me for the entire ride home. Something deeply wrong was happening on that highway. I did not see or experience this firsthand, but hearing about it in a place that is supposed to be safe was completely chilling. About 6 months back, I was staying at my family's ancestral village. I do not live there permanently, so the environment always feels a bit detached and quiet. I barely know anyone outside of the people living in the couple of houses directly next to ours. One hot afternoon, all the women in the neighborhood gathered on the porch. We were supposed to clean the raw rice, sorting through the grains under the heavy shade. I understand the local country dialect perfectly, even though I cannot speak it well enough to strike up a casual conversation, so I just sat there in silence, listening. As their hands worked, the aunts, grandmas, and sisters started gossiping about a horrific incident that had just taken place in the house right next to theirs. The details they shared made the blood run cold in my veins. A young girl, only about 20 years old, had been brutally attacked by her own brother right out in the open. This did not happen behind closed doors. It happened in broad daylight, right in front of a heavy crowd of local folks. He did not just use his hands, and he did not just use a wooden stick. This monster actually grabbed a giant heavy iron frame of a bed and began striking her violently. Then he pinned her defensible body directly to the dirt ground, locking her in a tight, suffocating chokehold. He held her down with pure fury until her body went completely limp and she was entirely unconscious. The most disturbing part of the story is that her own mother was standing right there. There were grown men present. There were plenty of capable adults watching the entire scene play out. Yet, absolutely nobody moved a finger. Nobody stepped in to pull him off her. The poor girl was later admitted to the regional hospital with several broken ribs, severe head trauma, and a couple more life-threatening injuries. And the reason behind this insane level of cruelty? All because she had allegedly answered back to her brother in a slightly rude tone during an argument. The locals did absolutely nothing to help her. They just watched the whole horrific show like it was basic entertainment. Later on, they actually excused the actions of that absolute monster. They shook their heads and said things like, "Oh, he was probably possessed by a bad spirit," or, "You know he is not usually like that." I found out about this absolute tragedy 2 days after it occurred. I was so disgusted that I immediately confronted my grandma. I begged her to help me file a formal police report or contact the local authorities. She just looked at me with a cold, detached expression and said, "That is not our matter. We do not poke our noses into someone else's house, no matter how criminally offensive that is." That mechanical, heartless response was the most shocking thing I have ever heard in my entire life. Cultural note: in many traditional, isolated agricultural villages globally, deep-rooted patriarchal structures and a strict code of communal non-interference often override legal statutes. Sociologists refer to this phenomenon as the bystander effect amplified by insular cultural norms, where domestic disputes, regardless of their severity, are treated as private family matters, severely hindering law enforcement intervention and victim advocacy. This story is incredibly difficult to process, even after all these years. It took place back in the deep woods of Northern California, where my family and I lived when I was between 8 and 11 years old. We were a unique mix between country folks and an alternative lifestyle. From about age 8 to 11, my family lived out in the dense woods of Northern California. We were a unique mix between hippies and country folk. I am old enough to remember a time before cell phones and the internet even existed. We did not have cable television, and kids back then mostly entertained themselves by roaming around the wilderness for hours. Since this was the decade of the 70s, we were usually left entirely to our own devices. One of the local kids in our rural circle was a boy I knew as Dennis. He was about a year older than me, and I liked him a lot. He was goofy, quiet, and just genuinely fun to be around. He even taught me how to ride a dirt bike, and we would spend countless hours riding around the isolated back roads and dusty trails together. One afternoon we were out riding when Dennis mentioned he needed to stop by his place to grab something. I had never been to his house before, although my older brother had visited once. After that single visit, my brother came back telling us that the man who lived there gave him a very uneasy feeling. He described the atmosphere as incredibly strange and uncomfortable, and he swore he never wanted to go back. That day, when we pulled up, Dennis turned to me with a tense expression and told me to wait outside. He explicitly said that Ken would be really angry if I stepped inside the home. At the time, they were living in a small, weathered trailer out in the middle of absolute nowhere, up a winding dirt road. There was a tall wire fence surrounding the entire property, and a massive dog barked non-stop at me while I waited by my bike. I distinctly remember looking up and seeing Ken standing at a window. He was staring down at me with a look of intense, obvious irritation. The whole situation felt incredibly heavy and strange. Eventually, Dennis came back outside with a blank face, and we left the property immediately. I tried asking him about his home life and about Ken as we rode away, but he immediately shut down, stared at the road, and refused to say a single word about it. When I turned 12, My family moved away from that sector, and I completely lost touch with Dennis. A couple of years later, when I was around 14 or 15, my mom sat my brother and me down in the living room because she had something highly important and terrifying to tell us. She explained that the boy we grew up with as Dennis was actually named Stephen. Then, she dropped something even more shocking. The man we believed was his father was not his father at all. According to what federal investigators eventually uncovered, Stephen had been taken away from his real family when he was a child of only 7 years old. The captor had lied to him, telling him that his parents no longer wanted him and that he had been given away like garbage. Being so young, he eventually accepted that grim story because he had absolutely no way of knowing otherwise. For years, Stephen lived under the absolute psychological control of that monster. He endured repeated severe abuse, manipulation, extreme isolation, and experiences that no child should ever have to go through. Even now, just thinking about it fills me with pure fury. While the rest of us were spending our childhoods playing carefree in the woods, Stephen was living through a horrific nightmare that nobody around him seemed to recognize. Then, when Stephen was around 14 years old, the dynamic changed. Ken brought another young boy home to the trailer. He altered the child's physical appearance and introduced him as Stephen's new brother. That little boy's name was Timmy White. One evening, while Ken was away at his job, Stephen finally connected the dots. He understood that the story he had been told about his own family was a complete lie. He realized that what had happened to him years earlier was now happening to little Timmy, and he knew he had to act. Wanting to protect the younger boy from the horrific future that likely awaited him, Stephen took Timmy by the hand and fled into the night. He somehow managed to travel roughly 35 miles through the rough terrain to the nearest sheriff's station in Ukiah. He successfully got Timmy to absolute safety. Afterward, Stephen reportedly tried to just slip away from the station, probably believing he had nowhere else to go in the world. But an alert officer noticed him, brought him back inside, and started asking questions. According to official reports, Stephen looked at the deputy and said something incredibly simple. "I know my first name is Stephen." That single heartbreaking statement began the massive process of uncovering the truth. Because of Stephen's heroic actions, Timmy was protected. Authorities learned the depth of the horror happening in those woods, and the entire case finally came to light. I have always considered Stephen an absolute hero. One thing that always bothered me was learning that the initial punishment Ken received was far shorter than what the public felt was appropriate. But the story did not end there. Years later, he became involved in additional incidents involving children. This time, authorities gathered enough concrete evidence to act decisively, and he ultimately spent the remainder of his life behind bars. When I heard he had died in prison, I felt that one of the darkest chapters connected to my childhood had finally come to a close. But there is one more strange historical twist to this family. Years later, Stephen's older biological brother, Carrie, became connected to an entirely different horrific criminal case that received massive national attention. If you are interested in true crime, there is a very good chance you have heard of his brother's dark legacy. To this day, I still struggle to understand how so many tragic historic events could be connected to a single family tree. And what stays with me most is the fact that none of us had any idea what Stephen was going through while we were all hanging out together as kids in the woods. After remembering this story recently, I went back and looked through old newspaper archives to double-check some of the specific details, and then I found something that genuinely shocked me to my core. Apparently, when Timmy was initially brought to that property, another local teenager had helped play a dark role in what happened. The deeply disturbing part is that I knew that teenager personally. For a period of time, he had actually lived in a trailer parked right on our own property, because my mother had a habit of trying to help troubled youths and giving them a place to stay whenever she could. Looking back, and realizing how all of these horrific connections overlapped right under our noses, is one of the strangest, most unsettling feelings I have ever experienced. Sometimes, reality ends up being far more unbelievable than fiction. Cultural note: the case described by the narrator corresponds to the historical kidnapping of Stephen Stainer by Kenneth Parnell in 1972 in California. Stephen notoriously escaped 7 years later to save 5-year-old Timmy White, leading to the famous television movie, I Know My First Name is Stephen. In a bizarre twist of fate, Stephen's older brother, Cary Stainer, was later convicted of murdering 4 women between February and July of 1999 near Yosemite National Park, becoming known as the Yosemite Killer. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.